My name is Peter. I was born in Germany at the end of the war, along with my older sister, which was born earlier than I. My parents were taken as forced labor from what is today Ukraine, but at that time it was under first Soviet and then German and then Soviet again rule. And after the war, my parents decided rather than going back home, which many of their family, my family did in fact do, they returned back to the Soviet Union, and most of them were executed, sent to Siberia. In many cases, I know, for example, my aunt was raped and had her breasts cut off. And her husband was blinded. That was a return home. So when my parents got a wind of this, obviously they opted for the United States. And we were lucky in that we came here and we lost our so-called sponsor, who was a farmer out in Wisconsin. By the time we arrived in New York Harbor, he had found other help, and we were about to be ready to be shipped back to Germany, where we were from. At that point, a church here in Passaic, what used to be Passaic, because now the parish has moved to Clifton, they offered to underwrite our sponsorship. They took us over, brought us here. We ended up living in Passaic, growing up in Passaic. So that's pretty much the background. There's quite a few similarities. I think the problem here in the United States is that we are seeing this in slow motion. And we think that this is more like an experience that would be beneficial to us, because I used to think in college when my professor would tell me, oh, we take all kinds of people in here to teach, leftists and everything. We don't let the Nazis come in, but we let the communists come in because we can learn from them. We had that attitude that there is something beneficial from a system that is so domineering and so invasive into the private life of every single citizen, that we think there's something to be learned from that. And there should be something to be learned from that, but we're not learning it. The problem is that we're missing the lecture. We either fell asleep on it or whatever you have. It's not catching on. Too many people are still totally, completely divorced from the realities. That doesn't just include United States citizens. I'm talking about Russians, where under the latest statistics that they showed about a week ago, 80% of the average Russians are supportive of the war and supportive of the form of government that they have under Putin. They still don't get it. I don't think that the politicians are trying to push us into a communist state. I think what they are trying to do is simply hold on to the power and influence they have so that they can shape what they consider to be a better world. And this includes both the green movement, whatever you refer to that group, people who are transvestites, etc., all of this. In most of the Europe, these issues do not surface at all. People accept people for what they are. It is only us who define it, and then we fight over it. And the fight is that opening door for the politician to step in and say, okay, I'll take care of it for you. The reason I think we don't learn is primarily because we don't understand the format that this is delivered to us. We don't understand that this was not an assault on our government. It was first an assault on our institutions of higher learning. It was an assault on our entertainment. Don't forget what Stalin said, give me Hollywood for 6 months and I will conquer the world. He wasn't kidding. And if you look at what is going on now, how much violence we show on our TVs, on our advertisements, etc., our games for children are virtually all are and somehow inclusive of violence. Violence has become acceptable. Okay? Once you have that kind of a status, the people who are in power, the politicians, can do whatever they want with you. That's what's important. For a young American growing up, and I know this from my own children growing up and my grandchildren now, it's extremely difficult to get a young person who is living in this posh, everything that they want neighborhood, and tell them, listen, get serious for 15 minutes a day, okay? Read a book. But what are you going to read? Most of the really effective books that describe the tragedy are not promoted in our schools. You look at the libraries that we have, you look at this teaching material that we have, nobody will pick up, and I know this because I've been shopping it around, nobody will pick up, for example, The Forsaken. You'll take a look and read Takedown by Paul Kangor, who examines the influence of socialism, transitioning to communism, where it comes from, and what it does to the social fabric. He covers religion, he covers culture, he covers all these other subject matters that most young people are not interested in. And when they do grow up and mature, it's usually too late by that time. Their children are off in college, they're exposed to the same stuff they were exposed, and they're rebelling against their parents. When you have a parent who lived through the 60s, through Woodstock, and finally came around to their senses, they are faced with a child going to a university that is far worse off than it was when the parent was there. So the parent is already fighting with the child is rebelling against the parent, but the matter doesn't address the problem. It doesn't. It just creates a conflict, which means somebody's going to step in and moderate you. We are all for moderation. I think as far as food is concerned and its allocation and the effects that eventually it has in the political system can best be seen in the Holodomor, genocidal famine of 1932-33 in Ukraine, where this was demonstrated in spades. Over 10 million people died, and the death by hunger is totally out of the imagination of the average American. They cannot understand what it's like they think you're hungry, okay, it's like going on a keto diet or something, you know? No, it isn't. It's when people lose their mind. It's when the people turn themselves against each other, where a mother has to decide which child is going to be eaten today, so tomorrow he can survive, okay? This to an American child who has Wendy's and McDonald's and everything everywhere he's probably overweight and probably not getting enough exercise. This is probably the least explored, least understood subject matter in the United States. And I know that friends, scholars who have been writing on it have been had the most difficult time in trying to sell it to a publisher and to get somebody to read it. Well, the things that were scarce back then, or even in Germany, post-war Germany, for example, and what we have today, would be very misleading if you try to make that comparison, because the standard of food was so much different then than it is now. We have processed foods, we have everything availability, delivery systems, etc. You got to understand that back then, it was not just a question of getting food, it was a question of delivering, hiding it, preserving it, okay? So people had far less to choose from. They had harder time to get access to it other than what they planted in their own gardens. And let me remind you, 32, 33, if you were caught with a potato hidden in your sack, you were shot. You're not allowed to retain and hide any food. Now, we're not talking about a McDonald's hamburger, and we're not talking about a steak. We're not talking about, something that we are familiar with. How do you explain to a child what that means? It's beyond comprehension for a child that is raised in American schools. I don't blame the child, I blame the schools because we haven't been teaching it.